Disclaimer, this is a video of me reacting to someone else's Five Nights at Freddy's theory. I don't always agree with them, but that has nothing to do with how I feel about them as a person or even their channel as a whole. I have and will continue to make it clear that I am a fan of this creator, and this video is simply me providing my own opinions on their theory. This video is not trying to say that I know better or am better than this creator, it's simply me seeking out other people's opinions so that I can explain the things that I agree with, the things I don't, and so I can understand these alternate opinions whether I agree or not. Anything negative I say or any negative reaction I have towards the theory is just me disagreeing, and I will always explain my point of view. Whether you agree with my stance or the creators, please just be civil towards both of us in the comments. Thank you and enjoy the video. Game theory. Finally reacting to your FNAF theories. This is 24 minutes and 21 seconds long. Let's go.
Was I wrong about FNAF's Secret of the Mimic? I spent months going over tiny details, analyzing everything frame by frame, trying to solve this fascinating game. But I wasn't alone. There were two other theorists who brought their own solutions.
Gibby and T-Dreads. I love these guys.
So are they right? Was I wrong? Let's find out. Hello Internet! Welcome to Game Theory, the show that knows solving the FNAF lore is a team sport. It's been a couple of months now since we finished our Secret of the Mimic extravaganza, where we left off on a, let's call it, divisive branching path. I did my best to present a couple of options as to why we were seeing so many similarities between the characters of David Murray, David Afton, and Gregory, from their looks to their families, even the beats of their own stories. One option was that the M2 Mimic takes on the role of David Murray. Afton adopts him as his son, becoming David Afton, and then when he breaks M1, the AI that assumed the identity of David's mother Fiona, decides to put him back together, creating Gregbot. Or there was the option that the first 7 games in the franchise weren't just in-universe games, but completely fictional, taking elements of David Murray's story and transforming it into a narrative about the Fazbear founder and his family in order to remove the Murrays from the picture. Like I said, two very different paths, and not everyone likes them. Heck, I even pointed out their flaws in those videos. But I wanted to show them.
I think both of them are extremely controversial.
Interpret the evidence. And since then, I've actually received a lot of comments asking me one very specific thing. Why wasn't I mentioning other people's theories? Especially when two of them were trying to answer the same question. Fate Fiona by Gibby's Horror Homestead and God David by T-Dreads. And the honest answer is, I hadn't watched them. I know that might be hard to believe. Us FNAF theorists usually want to take in as much FNAF content as possible, but as the amount of theorists has grown over the years, so...
What's funny is T-Dreads is streaming right now reacting to this, so I'm like really curious as to what he's saying about this, because I think his title or thumbnail was like, no way this is happening, or something like that.
It's the rise in comments accusing theorists of stealing ideas from other people. So to make sure I wasn't in any way influenced by their theories, even subconsciously, I purposely avoided watching any other FNAF theories while I was working on my own. It's a shame really, because at the end of the day, solving FNAF has always been about collaboration. It's why Matt did his live talkback after FNAF 4, and it's why we still do them today. We need to work together if we have any hope of getting through it. So now that I've been out of my Secret of the Mimic hole for a few months, I figured it was high time I checked them both out to see whether they were able to fill in any of the gaps that I...
Didn't GT Live also react to them, like on, well, didn't Ash react to both of them on GT Live?
Couldn't, or whether there's some combination of our ideas that could
maybe, or at least
make
the
this
God
story
David one, I think.
Finally makes sense. I hope you're ready, theorists, because it's time for another round of my trash takes.
Leave your theories in the comments or subreddit. I'll pick my favorite in the next episode of Trash.
Let's start with Gibby. As the name implies, Fate Fiona focuses on the character of Fiona Murray, David's mother. He posits that Fiona, after becoming the M1 Mimic and put into the Mex's machine, becomes this overpowering force that manipulates the world around her into repeating history. Not just her history either, but Fazbear's history as a whole, like the fires, the bad fathers, the houses being on top of the secret facility, and loads more. This immediately caught my attention as it explores a similar line of thinking to what I was exploring in my Games Are Fiction branch. But it manages to keep it all in universe rather than it being a fictional story borrowing ideas from from reality.
Yes.
Gibby suggests that Fiona is able to achieve this world manipulation through 3 main factors. Firstly, the idea that Fazbear keeps building on top of previous establishments, meaning all the remnant and agony of its victims are still present in the area.
Don't people call that theory like Fazburger or something like that?
This explains why in games like FNAF 1, we see the posters on the wall change, or why in Security Breach, there are random plushies hidden around the place. It's the classic burial ground trope. The buildings are haunted because they are built upon the dead. But when you think about it, thanks to Secret of the Mimic and Ruin, who specifically is dead and underneath all of these buildings? Right in the basement of MCM, waiting to put her son back together. Fiona.
She would be at the
Secondly,
lowest
looks at the
point, I
story
guess,
of Fetch
theoretically.
from Fazbear Frights, and the concept of how human thoughts, if strong enough, can actually affect subatomic particles in order to manipulate the world around them and other people's thoughts. This is a real-world concept called the 0-point field. Gibby explains that down there in the basement, Fiona's thoughts are so strong, her desire to rebuild her family so powerful, that she is able to utilize the 0-point field and affect the thoughts of those in the area, namely William Afton, subconsciously planting the name David in his head so that he calls his own child David, as well as subconsciously giving him the idea to stuff kids into suits, like the Mimic used to do back in the 1970s. And finally, there's the physical.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I do think it just kind of undermines Afton himself as a character, but like if this stuff wasn't like his own idea, but the David thing is fine. I think him stuffing the kids in the suits is a little much, but it's not a bad theory, though. It makes
Fiona
sense.
is plugged into
For the most part.
everything Fazbear touches, much like the storyteller was in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, an AI designed to connect to everything, but ends up infecting it with bad ideas and code. Similarly, Fiona gets plugged into Fazbear and so witnesses everything that happens throughout Fazbear's history due to the agony and remnant they leave behind, causing the technology to also repeat parts of history, like Fredbear killing David when the opportunity presents itself because her son David also died on the premises, or Glamrock Bonnie being locked away in a back room, destroyed, being watched by possessed wet floorbots. Much like Springtrap was locked away in a back room after dying, being watched by 5 spirits. Fiona is the central hub for everything, with her memories and will being so strong, she's forcing history to repeat itself over and over again. Now, when I first watched this video, I thought it was super out there, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it tied into a number of theories we'd already had on this channel. We did a theory ages ago about why we thought there was so much puppet imagery across the Pizzaplex, specifically in the wires connecting everything. At the time, we felt the best option was leaning into the only character we knew that had an association with the puppet, Charlie. We even equated it to the idea that she was haunting the building like an old school ancient burial ground, rather than being tied to a specific animatronic like we'd usually see. We had the same idea, it's just we didn't know Fiona was a character in order to tie her to all the puppet imagery instead of Charlie. Admittedly, it may still seem a little strange. Why would Fiona be associated with the puppets? Well, I think we can come up with a good explanation.
I mean, she was a puppeteer in, like, as mentioned in Secret of the Mimic, and also, as people have talked about recently, there's the whole thing where I think it was FNAF's recent video, where he talks about all the Nightmare On stuff. There's how Jackie kind of like turns into a puppet. Not only is she a Jack-in-the-Box, just like the puppet is, and has the same music as the puppet, but also ends up getting like black tears down her face and then like stripes on her arms. So she is a lot like the puppet in a lot of different ways. So theoretically, since Fiona is a puppeteer, just her association with MCM and stuff can theoretically connect her with the puppet too.
I can tell you all why the puppet makes sense. In another one of our Mimic theories, I suggested that M1 Fiona's memories are becoming muddied thanks to the amount of data she's received from the original games while being used to make Help Wanted. But while I focused solely on what she'd have learnt from Afton in order to make her glitch trap, there are other characters in those games she'd have learnt about and possibly even adopted as part of this new messy persona. Characters like Charlie. I specifically call
That is possible, but I will say there's also no guarantee that M1 is the version of the Mimic that becomes Glitch Trap, because she is literally Mixes, which is the thing that is used to keep the Mimic, which probably the version of the Mimic that becomes Glitch Trap, to keep that Mimic at bay. So the fact that she's that mimic makes it a little weird for her to actually be Glitchtrap rather than M2 being Glitchtrap, considering M2 is the one that actually is aggressive.
Out that she seems to be adopting traits from characters that she identifies with. Afton is a man that wants to put his family back together no matter the cost, for example.
I don't think
but
he
Fiona
does.
and the puppet share a couple of close connections too. They're both protectors of children, they both fail at their duty and the child dies on their watch. Fiona is also a puppeteer, so again, she has an association with puppets. And these similarities all add
exactly.
to M1 Fiona being a confused mess. She can't tell what is her and what is someone else. Is it Glitchtrap? Is it Charlie? Is it David? But that could be why we see all these things connecting the Pizzaplex giving off puppet vibes, even though it's supposed to be Fiona and not Charlie. On the flip side, if you subscribe to Gibby's theory wholesale, it wouldn't just be Data, but all the agony and remnant and memories of all the victims who died on this one piece of Fazbear land entering Fiona's system, meaning Charlie's memories are now part of Fiona too. But that also brings up...
I will say, it's a little strange that Charlie would be like the dominant one there, but I do think it does make sense like that Fiona would adopt that personality because she is a puppeteer. But I will say, the fact that I've said this before multiple times, the fact that it's Nightmare On imagery, and Nightmare On is Nightmare, aka Shadow Freddy, I think it's kind of weird that it would be Nightmare On specifically, rather than just the puppet. There are just puppet things, too, including, like, the striped wires and stuff, that is, like, the puppet, and... there's also like the staff bots themselves are security bots with tears and cheeks, just like the puppet is. The security puppet was a security device with tears and cheeks, right? Well, didn't have tears initially, but the puppet itself does have tears later on, right? So I think it's just kind of weird that it's specifically Nightmare On stuff in general, because those staff bots then turn into the Nightmare On looking ones. And although those like wires are striped like the puppet, the tentacles specifically, the puppet does have tentacles in one story, You're the Band, which is a scrap story, but still. But the tentacles are much more associated with Nightmare On in FNAF VR. And it's mentioned in Ruin that Nightmare On is from FNAF VR in universe, right? So the fact that it's Nightmare On specifically, like her imagery or his imagery that keeps popping up all over the place, it makes me a little bit skeptical to assume that it's Charlie that is causing it rather than like Shadow Freddy or something, if that makes sense.
The part of the theory that is possibly one of the biggest debates coming out of Secret of the Mimic. Is there possession, or is it just AI? For this theory to work, it requires you to be of the belief that the M1 Mimic program didn't just become Fiona through being an AI, but through possession, using the classic old school FNAF tools of things like Remnant and Agony. Two of the reasons I've seen for M1 being possessed are that she learned to be Fiona after Fiona had died, and that Edwin uses the frequency 4625 on one of the audio logs and hears the voice of Fiona after her death. This frequency is actually associated with a ghost radio frequency in the real world, known as the buzzer. As the name implies,
yeah, I did hear actually about 4625 being a ghost thing. I don't think it... I'm not sure it's actually like ghost related specifically, so I'm assuming that he's talking about it here. But I don't know, I think I googled it and it said like it was a ghost radio frequency, but it's not like a literal, like, spiritual thing, I don't think. But I could be wrong, I don't know. So I'm just going to listen to what he says here.
Radio frequency in the real world, known as the buzzer. As the name implies, it simply broadcasts a static buzz across the airwaves. But occasionally, you can hear words. Sometimes, even voices in the background. But the key thing is, no one claims to be running it, leading some to believe it's ghosts speaking from beyond the grave. However, upon looking into it more, it seems that this radio frequency is something more to do with Russian intelligence, with two other radio stations, the Pip and the Squeaky Wheel, also transmitting a similar signature sound, occasionally interrupted by coded Russian voice messages. It's real messages being sent by real people, not ghosts, which means that if Steelwool is invoking the iconography of frequency 4625, they're telling us, while it may appear to be something paranormal, it's actually a real person, or at least thing, that's sending the message. John FNAF has a great theory about how it's actually the mycelium men who have recorded Fiona trying to help Edwin. Because
I actually think that theory makes a lot of sense, based on the fact that like they listen into conversations and there's one right next to where that conversation was, and then that's the conversation that ends up playing when we hear that audio log too.
The AI Edwin
So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Inventions was designed to
know what you want better than you do.
which also explains how M1 learns to be Fiona. It's not from Fiona herself, but from the recordings of her through the Mycelium Men, which is why she acts like her, but she feels more stilted and robotic.
I baked it myself for David's special day.
And no, it's not just because she's a robot, but because she never learnt from the real thing. Plus, as I've mentioned before, Scott does seem to be moving away from the old paranormal stories he used to tell.
I have a tendency to lean sci-fi, so anything that involves possession of AI or possession of machines or circuitry, I love that sort of thing.
Since Help Wanted, we've been getting stories about AI taking over people, not Remnant or Agony. In the Tales from the Pizzaplex series, while we still get ghost stories, we don't really get much in the way of Remnant or Agony specifically. There's Frailty, where a girl has a Remnant necklace similar to the one from To Be Beautiful in Fazbear Fright, but it's rarely the focal point of this series. Again, emphasizing the move away from those old FNAF story beats and more into AI and machine sentience. And without
Yeah, like I do think that there are like paranormal things that are happening. Like I said, I think Shadow Freddy might be involved with the story right now, but I think that the Mimic specifically is probably mostly just just mimicking things, rather than it being like a spiritual thing. There might be some agony involved, but I don't think any spirits are involved, if that makes sense.
the real spirit of Fiona, it means there's no remnant or agony, and it becomes harder to explain things like the 0-point field. That's not to say it's impossible by any stretch. There are signs of some paranormal things going on at MCM. I mean, the white tiger costume feels very
for
much
sure.
like old school Golden Freddy. That, or it's just Arnold hallucinating.
I just finished a 36-hour shift and
Fair enough.
struggling to stay awake.
And the 0-point field idea comes from the story Fetch, and the Into the Pit game did tease a Fetch sequel, so maybe they are gonna bring it in. And the fact is, if it turns out to be true, Faye Fiona would help to justify my theory that Old Man Consequences is actually what remains of Edwin Murray. I suggested that because Edwin from the books comes back to help destroy the Mimic years later, that even though it seems like he died at the end of Secret of the Mimic, in reality, he didn't fully die, because no one ever dies in this series. I suggested that the king in Princess Quest, known as Old Man Consequences in the game files, was like Edwin's digital signature, a safety protocol inside the Mimic's programming designed as a failsafe to stop the monster he'd created. Fate Fiona.
I have like a similar theory where I think that Edwin probably is Old Man Consequences, but I think there's a possibility that he could be like what was left of the Edwin personality when he was taken out of the Mimic in the secret ending. So like that could have ended up becoming Old Man Consequences. That part I'm not sure about, but I do think that Edwin being Old Man Consequences does make sense. Let's continue watching.
Fiona also ties into this theory, just in a more classic FNAF way. Rather than Edwin leaving behind a digital signature, it's literally his agony and spirit that, like everything else, ended up inside Fiona's systems, which then plugged into all the arcade cabinets in the Pizzaplex, which then allowed him to appear in games like Princess Quest and even FNAF World. So while I'm not entirely sure...
That's a theory. That was basically my Old Man Consequences theory, but it goes like a lot deeper than just that. But yeah,
about the method this theory is based on,
I don't think it really has to involve him getting into Fiona systems, but just like getting into some Fazbear systems in general and attaching to the arcades makes sense.
Hey, it helps
Regardless of whether it's a spirit or not.
Pizzaplex, which then allowed him to appear in games like Princess Quest and even FNAF World. So while I'm not entirely sure about the method this theory is based on, I do have to say it helps explain a lot of our past theories, as well as a dozen other theories from across the internet. I also understand that it would be nice to have things like Remnant and Agony still feel like they're important today and not just a forgotten story device. But at the very least, Gibby and I can agree that one way or another, Fiona is definitely the one running the show here. But that's just one of the branching paths. And if you're enjoying this kind of branching path theory review thing that we're doing here, you should absolutely consider subscribing. Maybe you can hit the button before Fiona sets the Mimic on you. Probably got about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nice work. Huh, it didn't shut her down though. Ah! Whew! Anyway, the second and probably most requested theory for me to look at is called God David by T-Dreads. The reason this one came as so requested is because it actually has a lot of similarities to the other branching paths I presented. The reason reason David Murray, David Afton, and Gregory have so many similarities can't be coincidence. They must be the same person. However, rather than it being a bunch of robot kids, T-Dreads takes a slightly different approach. He focuses a lot on Gregory, pointing out a lot of the same similarities I did. Similar appearance, both being called Broken, sitting on a hill with their robotic protector, but the one extra piece he points out is the therapy CDs from Security Breach. These recordings are from therapy sessions with two different patients. One is Vanessa, with her being named in the tapes, and one is a mysterious unnamed patient, who we all came to call Patient 46.
I actually watched the God David Theory on stream. I don't remember which stream though.
Was in fact Gregory. This was later seemingly confirmed thanks to the story GGY, where we see a kid called Greg killing off these counselors when they got too close to the truth. The truth that Gregory wasn't really himself anymore, but being controlled by someone else. T-Dreads points out that multiple therapists call him out for making up stories, that he's lying about his past, almost like an AI reading from a script.
The way you told the story is more like you were reading something from a book.
But rather than it being because Gregory is a robot, it's because he's possessed by a version of M2's programming, a version of David Murray. He points specifically to the Balloon World arcade cabinet in Gregory's hidey hole, the one which, as you play, begins to glitch out and become corrupted, ending with the words "good night," as if Gregory is going to sleep and allowing M2 to take control. That's why when the therapists say lines like,
You had great parents.
it's because Gregory is telling the story of David's parents, not his own. Edwin definitely wasn't in the running for Father of the Year, and both Edwin and Fiona met tragic ends. But that wasn't true for Gregory's parents. I gotta say, I'm a fan of this. Even in my video where I brought up Gregory being a robot kid, I said I wasn't in love with the idea of having more robot kids around.
I think regardless of Gregory being, whether he's a human or not, I think that theory actually does make sense, that he's using David's, like, past. As for the rest of God David, obviously he's going to talk about it here. I am skeptical, but it's definitely an interesting theory.
On M2, now what, M3? It's just a lot of robot kids and not enough real people. And this use of the therapy CDs actually helps move away from that. A robot kid made inside the Pizzaplex by M1 Fiona and Vanessa wouldn't have physical records or files for the therapists to refer to. They wouldn't be able to say lines like, you had great parents, because he'd be an anomaly with no past. He literally just showed up one day. But if instead he's a real kid with his mind taken over, then he would have real records. That,
to be fair, it is possible that whoever it is possible that if Gregory was a robot, whoever built him could have just acted as their parent, kind of like in the books where Charlie is raised by her Aunt Jen, and her Aunt Jen knows that she's a robot. So it could just be something similar there, too.
might even explain why he ended up in therapy, because his teachers noticed he suddenly started acting differently. From there, he starts acting like and dressing like a slightly older version of David Murray, just like M1 wanted, only for him to be set free sometime before Security Breach. The only thing I would question about this idea is the specifics of exactly what is possessing Gregory. T-Dreads presents it as a version of the Mimic program that contains David's memories, which would seem to imply M2. He uses Balloon World's glitched...
I mean, I think M2 is the Mimic, so that would make... Sorry, I think M2 is Glitch Trap, so that would make sense to me. I think Glitch Trap is definitely who's possessing Gregory. It's just a matter of who Glitch Trap is, and I think it's M2, not M1.
Sun, as evidence for this, the character looks a lot like Eclipse, which is a character that represents the collaboration between Fiona, Sun, and Edwin's Moon. And so that shows us that David, or M2, is taking over Gregory's mind. But just like in my previous theories, there are a few ways you could interpret this, and mine would be slightly different in this case. So far, there's been one AI that clearly has the ability to take over people's minds. Glitch Trap. We saw it with Jeremy, who sadly sliced his face off, and with Vanessa, who mentions that in the therapy tapes there's part of her that is locked away. In many of our previous theories, we've connected Glitch Trap back to the M1 Fiona program, who, after being used to make games like Help Wanted, became muddled and confused as to what her true identity was. M1 Fiona is also represented by Sun, as we see in both the parachute ending of Secret of the Mimic and during Moon.exe. So when we see the sun glitched out in Balloon World, it's possible it's not showing us Eclipse, but simply a glitched out sun. It's sun that itself has been corrupted by the memory and influence of Afton, becoming a glitched trap for Gregory. So if we have an AI program that can take control of human minds, that human can also have an internal dialogue with, and it's the same one already taking over the entire Pizzaplex, it makes the most sense for Gregory to also be taken over by that same entity, rather than having a bunch of different mimic AIs all existing at the same time. Otherwise you end up with...
I think there's just 2 mimic AIs. Glitchtrap is everything except Mixes, which is M1.
Same problem that I had with my own Gregbot theory, where it's just so many of one thing, robot kids or AI, and it becomes so complicated that it's just not satisfying anymore. It's Occam's razor. Sometimes the simplest solution is the right solution. It being an AI, M1, wouldn't actually change the fact that Gregory has been mind controlled in order to make him a new David either. After all, M2 was a copy of M1's programming, and we theorize that M2 was originally being taught on how to be David through Moon.exe, essentially using the memories M1 had of David to help recreate him. It's just doing the same thing in Gregory's head. It would also tie more into Gregory's persona that we see in GGY, where he takes on the moniker of Dr. Rabbit, which feels more connected to Glitchtrap than to M2 specifically.
For sure, yeah.
Plus, Gregory is shown to be hacking the animatronics in that story, which again is not something we'd necessarily expect of David Murray, but would make sense for someone infected by Glitchtrap, who's trying to take control in order to make their vision a reality. But that's
and Glitchtrap clearly does possess the Glamrocks, if you ask me, so.
One part of that theory. The second half focuses on the similarities between David Murray and David Afton. T-Dreads once again does his due diligence and not only calls out the same things that I did, but adds a bunch more. Like the fact David Afton's favorite ride is the carousel according to the security logbook, but there isn't a carousel in Fredbear's. There is a carousel, however, in Murray's costume manner, almost as if he's remembering a different child's memories. There's also the line, "Do you miss them?" in the logbook, right next to a picture of Foxy writing a note. And in Moon.exe, there is a note asking the moon to bring back the sun because he misses them. Again, it makes it hard to deny there's a connection here. The challenge becomes the how of it all. Even T-Dreads admits that this part is a bit of a stretch because we just don't have enough evidence yet, but he presents the idea that psychic friend Fredbear actually contains a version of the M2 David AI which William uses to swap the mind of his son with David Murray. We see the mycelium men who contain mimic technology have the same black eyes with white dots. Glitchtrap resides in a spring body plush in order to swap minds with Vanessa, and this particular story structure is repeated all over the books, like the week before, Into the Pit, Gumdrop Angel, The Monty Within, but most prominently for this theory in a story called Lonely Freddy. A small Freddy asks a child questions to learn more about them in order to assume their identity, eventually swapping bodies with them. Ironically, this is almost identical to a theory we had many years ago. It's just now we understand why. M1 Fiona needs an animatronic genius like Edwin, and now, like Afton, to be able to rebuild her son. Afton is intrigued by these machines that feel alive, and so is willing to go along and plan so that he can study it. All of that makes so much sense, and again, lines up with the same motivations I presented. The main challenge I had with it was the timeline. In our original theory, and also in T-Dread's theory, it presents the questions that psychic friend Fredbear / the Lonely Freddy is asking are so it can learn stuff about David in order to steal his body and become David Murray once again. Except by the time we see him in the FNAF 4 minigames, he's already exhibiting signs that he is David Murray. He's wearing the same clothes, carrying the plushie around, he's scared of Foxy, has the same name. I suppose you could argue that these things are just things William conditioned him to do in order to make him susceptible to the mind transfer. But then, when does he take over? Is it after he gets bit, when he says, "I'll put you back together"? But then what happens to him after that? Why does he disappear from the story? And if it's before that moment, then it means Fredbear wouldn't have any need to ask those questions or be the M2 AI because he's already taken over David Afton's mind. Now, all of that being said, I do recognize that there's definitely evidence for the crying child being more like a human child than a robot one like I presented originally. After all, the key evidence that T-Dreads refers to, the security logbook, has two spirits talking to one another, the vengeful spirit Cassidy and the spirit of David. If the Fredbear plush was the M2 David Murray program, then David Afton's spirit would be present and able to attach itself to Fredbear in order to take control and then talk to Cassidy. Plus, in the logbook, we see David struggling with his memories, hence all the questions about favorite toys, rides, and even his name. Cassidy is trying to help him remember, maybe because his own memories have been suppressed for so long by M2, much like with Gregory and the therapy CDs, although we don't ever get the last name from that spirit. So I suppose there is a chance that this is really David Murray's spirit, trying to remember itself after years of wandering, kind of like we see happen to Jake in the Stitch Wraith stories. I mean, Cassidy is calling out that his favorite ride is the carousel, which, as T-Dreads points out, the crying child, David, wouldn't have ever witnessed. But we know that David Murray did. And all of this can be happening while M2 is walking around dressed like David Murray, now under the watchful eye of William Afton. And see, this is why I did the branching paths in that original theory to begin with, because it's important to explore all of the options. And I'm so glad to see other theorists exploring alternative ideas from the same evidence, while bringing up new points that agree, but also counter my own. Every theory has its strengths and weaknesses, but just because we don't like one part of the theory doesn't mean we have to throw the animatronic baby out with the bathwater. I love the evidence surrounding Gregory's possession by the Mimic. We may differ on the specifics, but it solves one of the big problems I had with the Gregbot theory. Even if I don't believe that M1 is physically possessed by Fiona, it doesn't mean that I can't use parts of that theory to fill the gaps that I had with characters like Old Man Consequences or the Puppets. And I hope that both Gibby and T-Dreads are able to take some of the additions or counters that I've made and run with them to help develop their theories even further. The point is, by exploring all of the options, we can get a better sense of what's really going on. So let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think the answer is one of these alternative branching paths, or do you think it's some combination of them? All I ask is that you remember to be kind and patient with one another, because at the end of the day, it's all just a theory. A game theory! Thanks for watching.
World premiere on Game.
Alright, I thought that was a pretty interesting theory. I will say I really don't know what to make about, like, all the connections between the characters. Like, I'm not sure whether I would believe, like, Fiona or God David, but I do think that there's a lot of evidence for them. As for, like, the glitch trap stuff, I think M2 being glitch trap just makes way more sense than M1 being glitch trap. And I think that M1 just sticks at... M1 is probably just mixes and nothing else. I don't think that she would be glitch trap. I think overall this is a pretty good theory. I think there's a lot that, like... There might be a couple things that he missed. Like, I think he should probably better consider M2 being glitch trap instead of M1. Because I don't think he's really even suggested that once. So, yeah, I think that this is a good theory, though. I think it's interesting to see him looking at other people's theories, too, and I think that's pretty smart to do, because, like, I mean, I don't watch that many FNAF theories, but I do if they really catch my interest, and if people keep suggesting me to. And I think that what is really important about watching FNAF theories is the fact that if you do, then you get to see other people's opinions, and you get to either strengthen or change your own beliefs depending on how they, like, how other people's evidence and stuff stacks up against your own. So I think it's really interesting to look at other people's theories, and I think it's smart that game theory is now doing that. I don't know if they'll do that again, but I think it's a good idea to do it. But yeah, overall, I thought this theory was pretty good, but yeah, that was my reaction.